Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about Chapter 4 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, titled The Carew Murder Case. I'll start by talking about what happens in this chapter. We'll then analyse the key characters, context, themes and quotes you may want to commit to memory ahead of your assessment. And finally, I'll leave you with an exam-style question that you can answer if you want to do some analytical writing practice. So, what's the plot? What's the story of Chapter 4, The Carew Murder Case? Well, this story picks up a year later. We can call this a flash forward in time. So a year later, a maid has witnessed a horrific crime. She was sitting in her room by the window overlooking the street, and what she saw was an aged, beautiful gentleman, who is later identified as Sir Danvers Carew, walking home. And in the other direction, a very small gentleman was walking. And Sir Danvers Carew said hello to the small gentleman, who is later identified as Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Hyde lost his temper, became quite animalistic and violent, and clubbed Sir Danvers Carew to death, quite violently, quite graphically, for no apparent reason. So witnessing this shocking crime, the maid fainted, and when she eventually came around, she called the police, who arrived at the scene of the murder. So when the inspectors and the detectives arrived at the murder scene, they looked for clues, and what they found was half of a walking stick. It was half of the stick that Hyde used to beat Sir Danvers Carew to death. They found a purse and a gold watch, which reveals that Mr. Hyde didn't beat up Sir Danvers Carew in order to steal from him, in order to take his wealth. So this implies that Mr. Hyde already has his own wealth, which we know comes from Dr. Jekyll. And finally, we find on the body a letter addressed to Mr. Utterson. So presumably Sir Danvers Carew had some sort of information that he wanted to communicate with Mr. Utterson through a letter. So the police took the letter to Mr. Utterson, and the next morning Mr. Utterson was informed of this murder. Now, Utterson visits the body and confirms that the victim was indeed Sir Danvers Carew, and that the half-broken cane indeed belongs to Mr. Hyde. He knows this because he gave the cane to Dr. Jekyll as a gift a few years before. Utterson then offers to take the policeman, who we later discover is called Inspector Newcomen, to Mr. Hyde's residence, which we know is called Blackmail House. When they knock on the door, an old lady answers, and Inspector Newcomen and Mr. Utterson are allowed inside Mr. Hyde's dwelling to explore and look for clues. The place looks like it's just been ransacked. Ransacked means sort of turned upside down, the drawers taken out, the clothes scattered everywhere. And there's a few clues that Mr. Utterson and Inspector Newcomen find that pin a lot of the blame on Mr. Hyde. For example, they find the second half of the walking stick that was used to beat Sir Danvers Carew to death. They find a chequebook in the embers, sort of smouldering away. They find certain clues that point to the fact Hyde has made a quick escape because he knows he's murdered Sir Danvers Carew and he needs to flee before he is caught. Inspector Newcomen seems convinced that he will eventually catch Mr. Hyde. So that was the plot of Chapter 4. Let's take a look at some of these characters in a bit more detail. Let's start with Sir Danvers Carew. We learn that Carew was an upper-class individual. He's described as having a high position. This would give him a gentlemanly status. He was involved in politics. Carew was old, beautiful, and a gentleman, and this is described in the phrase aged, beautiful gentleman. So he has that gentleman status, which you can link to the theme of being a gentleman that we've discussed in a previous video. And this idea that he was beautiful, it sort of contrasts with the horrific murder that takes place. So you have this really beautiful, almost angelic image, which is supported by the fact his hair was white, and the quote, white hair. And you can do a colour connotation analysis. White has connotations of purity, angels are normally dressed in white. So Carew is presented as really wholesome, really good, which makes Hyde's senseless murder all the more shocking to the readers. We learn that Carew was polite. He bowed and accosted Mr. Hyde. So bowing to someone shows respect to them. Accosted means you greet someone. Now, accosted can have a negative connotation, so you might greet someone aggressively, but actually Stevenson does write that Carew accosted Mr. Hyde politely. It was done out of politeness. Carew is described as innocent and kind. It says he's innocent and has an old world kindness. So again, it sort of paints him as like a grandfather figure, maybe. White-haired, beautiful, wise, just a really wholesome sort of person. Not the person you want murdered by some senseless, deformed, animalistic creature, such as Mr. Hyde. That would be very shocking indeed. And we learn that Carew was brutally murdered. Unfortunately, his body was incredibly mangled, so it was barely recognisable. He was beaten to death with such force by Mr. Hyde that his body was mangled. It didn't even resemble a human body anymore. So what do we learn about Mr. Hyde from this chapter? Well, we learn that he's small. He's called a small gentleman, though I definitely don't think he fulfills the gentleman status. In some cases he does. He comes from money. He has Dr. Jekyll's money to support him, but the way he behaves and his morals are definitely very ungentlemanly. Mr. Hyde is detestable. Detestable means, easy to hate. And even the maid, who's described as quite a romantic person who sort of loves humanity, even she was like, I've conceived a dislike for Mr. Hyde. Everyone seems to hate this guy. He exudes some kind of hateable, disagreeable presence. We learn that Mr. Hyde is easily angered. All Sir Danvers Carew did was say hello to Mr. Hyde, and Mr. Hyde broke into a great flame of anger. This metaphor, comparing Hyde to a flame, is quite powerful because flames consume and destroy everything, and this implies that Hyde can consume and destroy everything when he enters a rage. Mr. Hyde is described as wild, a bit like a wild animal being released. He's described as broke out of all bounds. This implies that he should belong in some kind of cage or some kind of shackle or some kind of chain to keep him in check like you would a wild animal. But he's too powerful, he's too angry, he broke out of his chains and he's after revenge. He's going to attack his captors. We learn that Mr. Hyde is animalistic. This is the simile my students like the most, ape-like fury, comparing Mr. Hyde to an ape. If you think of a gorilla sort of banging its chest, attacking another gorilla, it's quite powerful, it's quite a frightening, it's quite a wild image. Mr. Hyde loves a trample. He trampled the little girl in chapter 1. After killing Sir Danvers Carew, he trampled over him again. This is very animalistic. I think of like animals in a stampede, or if one animal has successfully killed another, it might trample on them. It's definitely not something you would expect a human to do, and especially not a Victorian gentleman. We learn that Mr. Hyde is forceful. He's described as hailing down a storm of blows. This is again metaphorical. It's comparing Mr. Hyde to a storm, in particular hail. Sometimes when hail forms and drops, it can be very powerful, it can be very painful, it can be perhaps even deadly. This describes how Mr. Hyde is powerful, painful, and unfortunately for Sir Danvers Carew, deadly. And finally we learn that Mr. Hyde is indeed a murderer. He's described as the murderer. The murderer was gone. So previously he'd trampled over a little girl. I mean, not great, let's be honest, but you might call that GBH, grievous bodily harm. It's a crime, but not as severe as murder. Now he is a murderer. That is a really serious crime. Okay, moving on to Mr. Utterson. In chapter 4, Stevenson really presents Utterson as not just a lawyer, but also a detective. And we learn this through the plot, through the actions that Mr. Utterson performs. When he's informed of the murder, Mr. Utterson acts like a detective by identifying the body and by confirming that the murder weapon belongs to Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson also assists the police by leading Inspector Newcomb to Hyde's residence so they could go around looking for clues. They found the other half of the walking cane, they found a half-burnt checkbook, they found that the place had been ransacked. Looking for clues is a very detective activity. Mr. Utterson, along with Inspector Newcomen, piece together all of these clues, just like a detective would, and come to the conclusion that Mr. Hyde is to blame. So all of these activities in this chapter present Mr. Utterson as a detective. It gives him detective status. And this means that as readers, we can classify The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the novella. We can classify it as Gothic horror, because there's elements of Gothic in there. But we can also classify it as the detective genre of fiction, because Utterson adopts the detective role to investigate these murders. This gives the novella a dual nature. Even the novella itself has two categories it could fit into, Gothic and detective. Let's look at Inspector Newcomen. He's not a massive character to remember in this novella. He works for Scotland Yard, which is the office of the police force. He wants to solve the case to further his own police career, and he believes that he can catch Mr. Hyde. He's not a super important character to know about, but I'm just presenting you with that information. Okay, let's have a look at some historical context. There was a lot of crime in the time when Stevenson was alive, in the Victorian era. So in Victorian London, crime was rife, particularly in overpopulated and poverty-stricken areas like Soho. Now, Soho is where Mr. Hyde's residence, Blackmail House, is. And this was a place where many murders occurred, many crimes occurred. Perhaps the most famous criminal to come out of this Victorian era was Jack the Ripper, sometimes referred to as the Whitechapel Murders. This occurred in 1888, so after Stevenson's novella was published, and some suggest that actually this novella might have inspired the real murders. Jack the Ripper wasn't caught, to the best of my knowledge, but some people suggest that he was maybe from an upper-class family or a well-off family, a bit like Dr. Jekyll, and then he committed very base criminal murders, a bit like Mr. Hyde. However, Jack the Ripper mainly murdered females, whereas Hyde murdered a male, Sir Danvers Carew. Now, this is where you need to be really careful. The novella, is clearly set in London. We get lots of references to names in London and places in London. However, Stevenson grew up in Edinburgh, the Scottish city, and actually, a lot of these things we see in London are mirrored in Edinburgh. So where London has particularly rough criminal areas and then other nice well-off areas, Edinburgh experienced the same divide. There were really dangerous criminal neighbourhoods in Edinburgh, and there were really nice upmarket neighbourhoods in Edinburgh. And now remember Burke and Hare from a previous video. These two were what you would call grave robbers or body snatchers. Remember the short story that I told you Stevenson wrote called The Body Snatchers? It was all about Burke and Hare and people who dig up freshly buried bodies to give to gentlemen scientists to perform anatomical dissection on. Now, Burke and Hare made sure they got very fresh bodies for their scientists by actually killing people from Edinburgh and then presenting their bodies and selling their bodies to these gentlemen scientists. All of this crime and setting, I think Stevenson has drawn from his experience of living and growing up in Edinburgh, but for the sake of this novella, he has set it in London. So again, there's a duality there. Stevenson's taking his own Scottish experience and overlaying it on London, onto his readership. Okay, thematically, what is the key idea in this chapter? I think it's the idea of violence. As readers, we get our first exposure to violence when Mr. Hyde trampled calmly over the little girl in chapter 1, called Story of the Door. Our second experience of violence is when Mr. Hyde murders Sir Danvers Carew in the Carew murder case, chapter 4. When you write about the chapters in your exam, you can refer to them simply as chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, or you could use their chapter titles if you have a very good memory. Now, why does Stevenson include violence? Well, his Victorian readership were fascinated by violence and murder, partly because they saw it in their everyday existence. Edinburgh and London in the Victorian era were violent cities where crime occurred. And I think we get violence in here because Stevenson, the writer's intention, Stevenson's intention is to force his readers to consider, is violence an intrinsic part of humanity? as humans, are we all prone to violence? As a society, if we just tried to curb this part of our humanity, whereas actually all of us have a little bit of Mr. Hyde inside of us and just want to explode with animalistic fury? It's a really interesting question to ask yourself. Okay, what quotes might you want to commit to memory from this chapter? Well, this chapter starts off in a very interesting way. Stevenson says this murder happened in October 18 something. Now, by not giving a specific date, I think this makes his Victorian readership hooked or fascinated or intrigued, because it could be happening the very year they're reading it, maybe the year before they've read it, maybe the year after they've read it. So by not giving an exact date, it almost gives this book a timeless feel. Not completely timeless, it has to be within 18 something, but as long as you were living in this century, if you picked up and read this book, you could have thought, Mr. Hyde could be murdering people on my street today, this very hour, this very minute. And remembering that your world in Victorian London and Victorian Edinburgh was full of crime, it might bring that sort of reality, that tension to life. Sir Carew Danvers is described as an aged, beautiful gentleman with white hair. You could look at the adjectives aged and beautiful. You could look at the noun gentleman and link that to the contextual knowledge of being a gentleman. You could look at the colour white hair and talk about the colour connotations. Sir Carew also has an innocent and old world kindness. You can look at those words innocent and kindness and then contrast it with the brutal murder Hyde commits. Hyde is referred to as a great flame of anger. That is clearly a metaphor. You could write about how fire consumes and destroys things, a bit like Mr. Hyde does. Mr. Hyde broke out of bounds and clubbed him to the earth. Broke out of bounds implies he should be caged up and locked out, but he breaks free and he causes violence. Particularly that verb clubbed is pretty violent, pretty graphic. Everyone's favourite simile, ape-like fury, comparing Mr. Hyde to some kind of gorilla or ape. This links to the idea of evolution, particularly the concept of devolution, unevolving, getting worse as a human species. Mr. Hyde loves a good trample. He's trampling his victim underfoot. It's a very animalistic thing to do, trample on something. Unfortunately, Sir Carew was left incredibly mangled, barely recognisable. Zooming in on either of those two words, you could describe just how violent and graphic the murder was. I haven't picked this out yet, but Stevenson does some great description of London. The first part I want to pick out is some pathetic fallacy and foreshadow. First fog, great chocolate covered pall. Pall means like a smog or a fog or a smoke hanging in the air. Embattled vapours, so this fog is battling, it's fighting. Hues of twilight, dark like a back-end evening. This simile is sort of hinting at crime in the air. So this pathetic fallacy, this is weather revealing some emotions and hinting, foreshadowing that there might be further evil to come, not just in this chapter, but in the rest of the novella too. We also get a really good description of London from Stevenson, and it's not the sort of place I'd want to live in. The paths are considered muddy ways. The people who live there are slatternly passengers. The adjective slatternly means sort of dirty or dishevelled. It has sort of sexist connotations. You'd normally use slatternly towards a woman to suggest that maybe she doesn't keep herself as neat and tidy and pretty and clean as she should. There's a mournful reinvasion of darkness. You mourn usually when you're at a funeral, so this might suggest that living in London is like living in a funeral. Invasion is quite military, it's quite violent. This maybe hints that London is quite a violent place to live in. And London is a city in a nightmare. This metaphorical language, if you live in London, you live in a permanent nightmare. Stevenson isn't really selling London, but he's giving a fair reflection of what certain parts of London would have been like in the Victorian era, particularly places like Soho, where blackmail houses. And at the end of the chapter, we get this quote about Mr. Hyde. He has a haunting sense of unexpressed deformity. And we go back to that word deformity or deformed to describe Mr. Hyde. So, you can make some notes from this video on a physical copy of the novella. That would really help your revision before your exams. And you could also have a go at answering this exam style question. How does Stevenson present the theme of violence in the Carew murder case, also known as Chapter 4, and elsewhere in the novella? I personally would refer to Chapter 1, when Hyde tramples over the little girl. Get some quotes from both Chapter 4 and Chapter 1, and maybe produce a couple of paragraphs of analysis. If you found this video useful, please like it. Please also consider subscribing to my channel to get the rest of my Jekyll and Hyde analysis, and feel free to leave a comment if you think I missed anything out. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.